Buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to thank you very much for having taken the time to attend this event, which is a very significant one. It's an important one for the Italian community who are present here today. People are also able to follow this meeting in web streaming. And without further ado, I'll give the floor straight to the co-chair of the EFDD group, David Borelli, who I'd like to thank for being here today.
Good morning, everyone, and I'd like to welcome you very warmly to the European Parliament. I'd like to start by thanking you for letting me remember and think together with you about this significant agreement between Italy and Belgium. Without then going into the historical analysis that will be carried out by people who know a lot more about it than I do. I would, though, like to reflect briefly on the political issues. There are lots of anniversaries of what's happened in the past. Sometimes it was a glorious past, sometimes there were bright spots and shadows, but all of these belong to our history, and they all offer us lessons for the present and suggestions for the future. I think that this agreement, with its bright spots and shadows, has taught us something, and that is that the history of peoples, of countries, and therefore the history of individuals is not something that's conditioned by treaties, but by something on an everyday basis, something more tangible, but that also tries as far as possible to improve our everyday lives. In this day of reflection, I hope that we'll be able to find those useful lessons. Together with my colleague, Ms. Agea, we are called upon to build the future for ourselves and for others, and to do that we need to learn from the past. I think that today there's a very strong Italian presence with 73 MEPs. Italy already plays an important role in the European Union, but I think it needs to do more. I think it needs to have more of an impact. And Italy does need, in this place, to declare its identity, an identity based on culture, tourism, and also innovative and inventive SMEs, which are very important for the fabric of our country. I'd like to thank you once again for the invitation, and I hope that our work today will be extremely productive and that it will be just the start of our cooperation for the future. Thank you very much.
Grazie, David.
Thank you very much, Davide. If you'll allow me, I'd just like to take a moment to try and explain why we're here today. The Five-Star Movement is the voice of citizens within the institutions. So we are a kind of amplifier for all of the requests that we receive from citizens, because we are citizens ourselves. A few months ago, one of the mails we received came through to me through a spokesperson of the local administration of Orvieto, and that's Lucia Vergaglia, who's here with us today. And she proposed this event. We put it together, we conceived it and built it. Her father, Antonio, is here to tell us about his experiences, and I'd like to thank them first of all. We're not here just to remember. It's not memory as an end in itself. What we wanted to do today is try and ensure that the light and shadows of the past can provide some lessons for us, so that it could become a starting point, so that we could look back at the past, treasure it, but also use that experience to put it into a positive vision, so that we can build something substantially different, to open up new opportunities. Today you've got a number of institutions here, institutions representing Italians here in Belgium, and having all of you here together is a moment to bring people together, a moment that should be a positive moment. I work here as a member of the European Parliament. I've had no direct link to the agreement itself, but agreements are a major topic here in the European Parliament. Working conditions, living conditions, and there's a major idea that needs to be brought out. We need to be a kind of glue, bringing together all of the Italians that are living here in Belgium, so that we can come together and create a future of true cohesion. The other day, I talked to a Belgian Italian in the third generation. And when we were talking together, he said, "It's funny because you're not Italian enough to live in Italy and you're not Belgian enough to be properly Belgian." I think that what we want to do today is to pledge to work together to create a new identity, an identity that could be a common identity. And that's what Europe needs right now, a sense of common identity, a proper union of imaginations. I'd like to close my introductory remarks by showing a brief excerpt from a documentary film produced by Lucas Zullo, Sulphur and Coal. It tells a little bit about the protocol and the effect that that protocol still has today here in Belgium. Thank you.
I governi non sono fieri di questo tipo di accordo perché infatti il governo italiano, per esempio, aveva venduto una parte della gioventù per avere delle rimesse, per avere un po' meno di disoccupazione, per avere un po' meno di movimenti sociali e politici e per avere la sicurezza di avere delle fonti energetiche. No?
Sono partito dal paese un passaporto, un fazzoletto, senza mangiare. Ho chiesto a mamma mia il 13 febbraio di avere 500 lire e mi ha detto: figlio mio, sei stato fortunato ad avere un passaporto. Ho preso un pugno d'olive e il 14 febbraio mi ha tenato un pezzo di pane di 150 grammi a 22 anni e 8 mesi.
In Italia si stava troppo male.
E siamo venuti nelle baracche dei prigionieri della guerra.
Per primo tempo hanno messo questi immigrati dicendo qualche mese poi vi diamo la casa normale. In quello che esisteva, sarebbe a dire, i campi di prigionieri dove qualche anno fa prima serviva per i prigionieri tedeschi, per i russi, cose così. Dunque io ho abitato in un campo dove era un baraccamento come Auschwitz.
E nelle baracche avevamo 4 stanze per 8 persone. Niente pavimento, non c'erano pavimento, non c'erano niente. Una stufa sola di 5 persone.
La giusta si l'ascolta questo dura.
La sicurezza non esistiva.
In tutto era 1415 metri di profondità. È troppo caldo.
Non c'era regola perché i bambini che volevano andare a lavorare andavano là e potevano lavorare senza assicurato, senza niente. Dopo la nostra giornata uscivamo fuori nere come il carbone, ci voleva un'ora per lavarsi.
Una sera con un'amica mia abbiamo detto andiamo a vedere quando escono i menatori, per vedere, era tardi. Non si conosceva nessuno. Tutte nere. Non si vedeva né la faccia, niente.
Quella che mi ha tradito la mina in Belgio è stata la polvere. I promoniti si sono riempiti di polvere e la polvere che è entrata non escirà più.
Arrivavo a Villarosa, in Borghese caso, e veniva in Belgio e c'era il siciliano che era. Io non avevo patria.
Quelli che amiamo più l'Italia siamo all'estero, perché ci manca l'Italia.
Ho la famiglia tutta qua, i miei figli, tutti. Cosa vuoi? I genitori sono morti, cosa ci vado a fare?
Siamo nati lì e dobbiamo morire qui.
Tu, uomini figli, con queste condizioni, tu quando vieni, le mani si devono tenere alla tasca. All'orario te ne devi andare a casa.
Certo che è interessante perché è un po' un conservatorio di una civiltà che non esiste più.
E adesso mentre
Well, now while I thank you once again for your presence here with us today, I'll hand over the floor to Ambassador Dirk Wouters from the Belgian Permanent Representation to the EU, and I'll also be giving the floor to Ambassador Vincenzo Grassi from the Italian Embassy in Brussels. I'd like to thank you all for your presence today once again. Thanks for your enthusiastic participation. So I'm very glad that you've all taken up our invitation. Thank you very much.
Buongiorno, signore e signori.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start by thanking Laura Agea and also David Borelli for this great initiative and for inviting me to be here today. Since we have interpreters, also interpreters who work with French, I think it would be wiser for me to continue in French, if you don't mind. As we know, Italy today is one of the main entry points for immigrants mainly coming from Africa. But there was a time when Italy itself was a land of emigration and a source of labour for other countries, such as Belgium. It was in the wake of the Second World War that Belgium was attempting to resolve a problem that it had in terms of a shortage of manpower in coal mining areas, since Belgians were increasingly unwilling to do the arduous work at the bottom of the mines. At the same time, Italy was facing a high unemployment rate, and Italy also needed as we saw in the video, fuels which were essential for its economy to recover. This was the backdrop to the protocol between the two countries. It provided for the recruitment of 50,000 Italian workers who were then sent to the coal mines in Belgium. The Belgian government, in return, committed to send the agreed amounts of coal to Italy at preferential rates. Today, we are celebrating the 70th anniversary of the protocol signed in Rome on the 23rd of June 1946. That was the start of several hundreds of thousands of Italian citizens emigrating to Belgium. Article 11 of the protocol stated that the Italian government would endeavour to send 2,000 workers a week to Belgium. 2,000 a week. Recruitment was mainly carried out in the most deprived areas of Italy from a rural and largely illiterate population, as demonstrated by the many contracts that were signed with a simple cross. The Belgian government committed to providing miners with decent accommodation, food, social benefits, and salaries, which were set on the same basis as those of Belgian miners. When I reread the protocol, I was struck by a paragraph which specifically dealt with family benefits that were to be paid by the Belgian government to families of Italian miners where the children lived outside of Belgium. As you are very well aware here in the European Parliament, this is a topical subject again, 70 years later, as we address the debate on the free movement of workers. Ladies and gentlemen, we saw in the video the kinds of working and living conditions that these Italian immigrants had. And at least at the beginning, these conditions were extremely harsh. One of the greatest difficulties the immigrants had was finding accommodation. It was often unhealthy and worse than what had been promised. At first, the miners lived in canteens and shacks which had previously housed prisoners of war. The work they did was exhausting and dangerous. There were illnesses, and then there were fatal accidents, the saddest example of which was the terrible tragedy at Marcinelle in August 1956, in which 262 people died, of which 136 were Italian. After the disaster, Italy put a stop to its policy of sending workers to mine coal in Belgium. At the time of the tragedy at Marcinelle in 1956, Italian miners had certainly started to integrate, but it wasn't easy. Some Belgian landlords didn't want to rent their properties to foreigners. Often there were very poor relations between Belgian and Italian miners. Miners suffering from silicosis, a disease caused by the chronic inhalation of particles, wasn't taken into account. This wasn't recognized as being an occupational disease. Later, immigrants were taunted by locals that they had come to take advantage of Belgian social security. The geographical concentration of Italians in the areas around mining towns was often a cause of prejudice and sometimes racism. There was the issue of the children going to school. For some Italian children, school was a place for social mobility. For others, it was a place where they were relegated because they got behind with their schooling and they were systematically steered towards vocational training. After the terrible events in Marcinelle, Italian immigration went to other economic sectors, metalwork, chemistry, construction, or transport. Due to the economic crisis, some Italian migrants looked for small-scale shops and restaurants as a solution. In the early 1990s, the last mine in Belgium was closed, and this also closed an important chapter in the history which connects our two countries. Many Italians, when they reached retirement age, went back to Italy, but the majority stayed. Today, among the foreign nationals living in Belgium, there is an increasing number of Italians. In addition to the Italians who have acquired Belgian nationality, according to a recent study, almost 3% of those living in Belgium are of Italian origin. The Italian community in Belgium is mainly established in Wallonia, for the historical reasons of which we're aware. In Flanders, the Italian community is mainly concentrated in the province of Limburg, in the towns around the former coalfields. Once Italians were included in the workplace, they gradually found a place in Belgian society. Today, even though we can't generalize, I think we can say that Italian migrants and their families are integrated. They have contributed to the economic development of Belgium, and whilst adapting to local culture, have also helped our culture develop. The Italian migrants who settled here and their descendants have noticeably contributed to making Belgium a more diverse place at all levels. In a nutshell, they have contributed to making the country what it is today. The first time I met Madame Agea, she asked me whether we could draw any lessons from what has happened and what we could apply then to the world we live in today. The 1946 protocol was meant to be a win-win agreement. It was meant to equally benefit both sides. Currently, a new wave of immigration for work could be beneficial, not only for those in search of a better life, but also for the host societies in Western Europe, countries like Belgium. More and more companies are experiencing difficulties recruiting workers, both for low and high-skilled jobs. Economic immigration could potentially resolve this problem. Economic immigration is also considered crucial against the backdrop of demographic change in Western Europe. And we recently saw that in the reaction of the German Chancellor to the migrant crisis and the arrival of refugees in Germany. It seems obvious then that new immigration is of benefit, but we also need to make sure we learn the lessons of the past, since there are major challenges in terms of immigration and integration. Many immigrants initially plan to move to another country as a temporary measure, but the real situation is quite different. In most cases, the move is a permanent one. We need to watch out for political answers which see immigrants just as pure economic actors. The issues at stake with migration are more social, political, and cultural, rather than being purely economic, and require well thought out policies in education, language learning, academic and professional development, culture, social policy. Of course, we should bear in mind that immigration doesn't only involve men. Often women come as well, and they need to be integrated into the labour market and into society in general. As a consequence, every policy relating to immigration for work needs to consider gender-related aspects. The immigrant, too, will have to come to terms with the idea of a long-term, if not permanent, stay. to integrate into a host country, they'll have to combine the cultures of the country of origin and the host country. Thanks to new information and communication technologies, immigrants can more easily stay in touch with their country of origin, as well as with people from the same region who have settled outside of Belgium. For this reason, reconciling one's attachment to one's roots and a desire to integrate in a host society has become a greater challenge than it was in the past. Ladies and gentlemen, immigration has profoundly changed Belgian society. We have become a multicultural society. You only need to see the Belgian football team to notice that. I would like to conclude by saying that today it was a huge honor to be invited to be here with you. I also think of Italy as a homeland, a second homeland if you like, but still a homeland. In the last few days and weeks, it's been a source of great joy for me to read through the stories that people recounted. Many people who came to Belgium, obviously under difficult circumstances, as I've said, but these people, I think, do a great honor to their country, to their family, to humanity, and I hope that we will have that friendship still between Italy and Belgium. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that we'll certainly have plenty of opportunity to pick up on some of the ideas that our ambassador left for us, but we'll now pass on to Ambassador Grasso. Yes, I'd also like to thank Mrs. Agea and President Borrelli for this initiative. I think it's a very important one. I'd also like to thank everyone present, including parliamentarians from the European Parliament, and I've seen some of them at previous celebrations for this agreement. Now, the commemorations of 2016 represent a duty to commemorate, but more than that, there's areas of light and shade in the past, but Mrs. Ajay was right when she said that it's a source of lessons for the future. Philosophers have said those who don't study the past are condemned to repeat the mistakes of the past. In human history, there's always a need to focus on the data. If you've studied at school, you'll remember all of the dates we had to learn: the discovery of America, the French Revolution. Dates are important to our memory. And in the relationship between Italy and Belgium, the date 22nd of June 1946 is a structural date, a landmark. And 1956 is a similar landmark because that was the biggest industrial accident ever in Europe or in Belgium. The first agreement was signed 20 days before Italy became a republic. It is important as a landmark, and it's exchanging a raw commodity of coal against the commodity of human labor. But rather than talking about immigration, I think it's better to talk about migration. I think there's few countries in the world where you see so much diversity of origins and the different occupations that migrants have got into in this relationship between Italy and Belgium. Belgium achieved its independence 30 years before Italy, and over the centuries it's received Italian exiles. Figures like Mazzini spent part of their exile in Belgium. the relationship started before 1946 in some areas of Wallonia. The Italians started to arrive in the 1920s. Many were exiles during the fascist period in Italy. Many came as refugees. Many went to France, but others went to the French-speaking parts of Belgium. But the agreement of the 22nd of June 1946 represents a step change. The presence of Italians in the mining areas of Belgium took on impressive dimensions, and they did lead to a number of social issues that I think Mr. Wouters expressed those very well. But the presence of Italians has been a continuous one. The creation of the EU institutions led to a mass arrival of civil servants as well. And there's a continuous process that's never stopped, a kind of dialogue between linear and circular historical processes. We're seeing new forms of immigration these days that are very difficult to classify. Belgium and Brussels in particular is receiving huge numbers of Italian graduates, some of them on work experience placements at the EU, but others are opening restaurants. About 2,000 of the Italians registered are in Belgium are Islamic Italians. In the 1980s, Italy started to receive Islamic immigrants. Many lost their jobs in the economic crisis from 2007 onwards, and they came to Belgium. Some had family links. And, of course, they're may be tempted by the access to a welfare state that is somewhat more generous than the Italian system. So there's been a long and deep-rooted presence of Italians in Belgium. For institutional reasons, I think it's important that we should consider how the Italian immigration in Europe since 1946 has intersected with the process of European integration. 1956, the year of the Marcinelle disaster, it was 1 year before the Treaty of Rome, but the disaster was in some ways a stimulus for the community of coal and steel that had been set up a few years before to start looking at issues of occupational safety. In 1956, the working conditions in Belgium's mines improved significantly in the wake of the disaster. Marcinelle is a symbolic event because, of course, 262 people died in one day. But the history of mining accidents in Belgium has seen at least 3 disasters on a similar scale to Marcinelle. Blenny, Clermont, other places in Belgium where there were similar kinds of disasters, even before 1956. I think it's also very important that this important monument at Bois de Cazier has been set up partially thanks to European cohesion funds. And I think that this in part explains why from the end of the 1950s and then moving into the 1960s, the notion of the migrant worker became increasingly dissolved into a broader concept of freedom of movement of workers and European citizenship. Back in 1957, when the Treaty of Rome was signed, the embryo of structural policy that now makes up such a huge proportion of the EU budget was included thanks to the efforts of Italy. Italy was the only one of the 6 founding members that was interested in these kinds of issues because they were the only one with migrant workers present in all 5 of the other member states. And this brings us to the dialectic between circularity and linearity. There are some concerns about the current developments, or backwards developments indeed, of European integration. But freedom of movement means it's unacceptable for us to close our doors to what's coming from outside. But it's important that we shouldn't allow further fragmentation within. These days we've got heated debate going on about Brexit and whether the UK is going to stay in the European Union. Okay, that's a domestic debate within the European Union, but I'm sure that other countries in Europe are keeping a close eye on it and have similar debates going on at home. The UK may remain in the EU with a number of concessions that could represent a dangerous precedent, particularly in terms of freedom of movement of citizens and workers. In some European countries, we're seeing alarming expulsions of European citizens into other European countries. So I think that these are events that should give us pause for thought. But also, I think that there are glimmers of hope. 2016 has been a huge opportunity to see local authorities, communities in Belgium now carrying out a very impressive role. If you look at regions of Belgium where Italian immigrants are now in positions of power as mayors or local politicians, there are some statements that are quite banal about the digital society stopping us from having a proper, thorough analysis of history. But Italians of second and third generations are very interested indeed in taking this opportunity to commemorate, to remember and to draw lessons from this that can strengthen us against the regressive forces that we see rising across Europe. We've seen cultural events. We've seen Italian historians go back to the places of origin of their grandparents. In many of these places, there's now a huge proportion of people who come from third countries. So you can see that there's a kind of circularity in history. That people are discovering memories and values from the past. And I think that that can strengthen us in trying to overcome the uncertainty we face in our societies, in economic terms, in demographic terms. Immigration is always very tough to deal with. It's an experience that brings with it feelings of loss and weakness. But at the same time, migration is a powerful antidote to this idea of a monolithic single identity, an idea of absolute values. Migration brings into our societies an element of diversity, and it's an achievement and a benefit for those who receive migration. I think Belgium has received a huge Italian community, people who came to Italy, who in many cases lost their lives in Italy, but they have been a force that has enriched Belgium. And I think that everyone in Belgium recognizes that today. I'd like to thank all of the institutions who've taken initiatives to the commemorations. The Ministry of Culture in Italy has also been involved. There's been an excellent restoration of a famous Italian film by the Belgian Cinematheque. It's been a restored film that's been successfully shown to a European public. Thank you very much.
Ringrazio.
Well, I'd like to thank Ambassador Grassi very much indeed, because his words have opened up an avenue to the past, but which is also linked to the present. Here we have a core which will be the core of our debate. Remembrance is important. That's why we're here today, to remember the good and the bad things which have made us what we are today. But if we take a moment to think about it, the past can make us better. It can be a true testimony of how the past can make the future better. There were different policies then. There was a sense of community which is missing today. We all seem to be like satellites and always never really in the same orbit. But together we can build a new identity. It's not what we were, what we are, but what we want to become. I may be being presumptuous, but I think that major advances in our situation are made up of small-scale dreams, which then we are committed to. Now I'd like to hand over to Antonio Vergaglia. I'd like to thank him very much indeed for coming along. He's here together with his daughter, and it's wonderful to be able to hear directly from him. He'll tell us about his experiences as an immigrant in Belgium. I would just like to ask you to stick to the time limit so everyone will have a chance to tell their story. Go ahead, sir. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, and I'd like to thank the Belgian community which has hosted us and which have treated us so well. It's amazing to be invited here because I never imagined that I would be invited back to Belgium, and I'm extremely happy to be here today. When it comes to the way we were treated well. They looked after us and we were treated like normal workers in Belgium. There's not much more to say. But we have kept all those memories that we were given. It seems that lots of people are complaining, but Belgium is a great country which hosted us then and hosts us now. I'd like to thank you all. If you ever want to know anything about my experiences, then do contact me. And all I can do is thank you for organising this event, because it's been an opportunity for me to come here today. Thank you all.
Ed è anche questo.
Well, that's part of Belgium too. It's the memories of someone who's had a positive experience, someone for whom migration was positive. And I think it's only right that we should see this experience from every different perspective. Antonio is among those Italians who saw this as a positive opportunity, who managed to experience this in a positive light. Not everybody was so lucky. And today we're here to hear the experiences of everyone concerned. And I'll give the floor to my colleague, Mark Tarabella, He's a fellow MEP from the Socialists and Democrats political group. He's going to be telling us about a different experience, one that started in difficult circumstances but has become a very positive experience. He can tell us a little bit about the many battles he's been fighting. And I'd like to thank him for having been available to speak to us today.
Grazie, Laura.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you, Borelli, Mr. Borelli, and thank you for all of our invited guests. Thank you for having come here. It's a pleasure and an honor, as my ambassador has just said as well. It's a pleasure to be here before you, particularly because of my own personal story. I'm a Belgian citizen, but of course my father was an Italian, and it was my grandfather who came here in 1946 to work. He wasn't a miner. He was one of the other workers who came under the agreement. He's from the area of Lucca in Tuscany, and he came to work in the quarries, in the marble quarries. He went to Neuville. It's the same kind of thing he was mining as he would have mined in Tuscany. It was a kind of grey-blue granite. That's where my mother met my father, and I was brought up speaking Italian, and at that time the Italian consulate made it possible for us to have lessons after school. And then I learned a little bit of Italian on my own as well afterwards. I realise I don't speak perfectly today, but it's enough for me to chat with Italian colleagues, and it's a pleasure to do so. Well, my family's story is the story of a family that's worked very hard and invested a lot in work. Italian immigrants left their country, they left their families to work here in very difficult conditions. The conditions in the mines were particularly bad, but the work in the quarry was pretty tough too. I can remember my father coming home from work. He'd leave the house at 7 o'clock in the morning. He'd come home at 5 o'clock, change his clothes, and they would then go to the factory to work afterwards. He'd do a day and a half's work on Saturdays and Sundays. Then there was work as well, so it was a pretty tough life. But what I always used to hear from my parents was that you have to go to school so you can have a better situation than ours. I constantly heard those words, and I'm sure that everybody recognizes that people work hard to give their children a better future. I'll now switch over into French, because it's my mother tongue, of course. But, well, I'll put this in light-hearted terms. I don't want to call it racism, because Belgium is a welcoming country. Those who came to the mining towns, they used to have signs up in the windows of cafes and restaurants saying, "No dogs, no Italians." I mean, it's true, that did exist. But I came from a small village near to Liège, and I've been the mayor of that town for 20 years now. I mean, they called us macaroni at school. And that's in March 1972. They said that when Inter Milan took on the Standard de Liège in the Champions League Cup. But I've got a Inter Milan keyring because I've always been a fan of Inter Milan. So of course my greatest sporting pleasures is thinking back to 1972 when an Italian beat Eddie Max. Well, Eddie Max was a great, but Mr. Gimondi beat him and was the world champion in 1973. I was 10 years old. 1982, Italy, Germany. I'm sure you'll remember Rossi's goal. And Altobelli. And I went up to 3-1 at the end of the day, but And then there was the Inter Milan victory in the Champions League Cup. So it might seem funny, but they used to say, "We're going to beat you, macaroni," but they had to eat their words. Well, tonight it's Belgium-Sweden, and it's nice to see Belgium get a chance to perform at a high international level. But there were a few words that were said a few minutes ago that we will never forget the sacrifice of those who had to work hard in difficult circumstances. But it's important because we've got the same thing going on today. You've got migrants coming in who are not welcome to many people. We've got migrants working, maybe just 100 meters away, working for €5 an hour. There are people in favour of workers' rights, the right to dignified labour, etc., etc. But even in this house, they consider workers as being like cattle, just a commodity that doesn't have any social rights, that's simply supposed to be an asset in the race to competitiveness. We see the same kind of thing going on today. So we do need to remember our past, as our ambassador said. Otherwise, if you don't study the mistakes of the past, you're condemned to repeat them. That's it. It's important to remember. I've got information on the on my internet site that says pretty much the same thing. If you don't know where you come from, you don't know where you're going. Thanks.
Grazie.
Thank you. And I don't think I really need to comment on that, because Mark never needs any kind of comment on things like that. So thank you very much. Now it's a pleasure for me to introduce Enrica Buccione. She is the granddaughter of a victim of the Marcinelle accident. But I did want to draw attention to her experiences. That's part of what I wanted to do today, to reflect and try to grow. If you look around the room, you can see some images, and she figures in some of those images. If we look around the room, these are photos that have been taken by her husband, and it's an unusual story because all of this feeds through from the story of her grandfather, but also all the women in her family. Enrica's grandmother became a widow aged 35, and I'm very pleased to have her here today. It's a source of pride for me because she has really understood how that past experience can be a tool for a better future. Good morning, everyone. It's an honour for me to be here today, and it's a huge responsibility for me to speak because I'm not just speaking on behalf of myself, but all of the women in my family who were affected by the mining disaster at Marcinelle. I'm the granddaughter of a victim, Cesare di Berardino, and on that tragic day, we didn't just lose him, but 5 other relatives and many other friends in our community. My grandmother became a widow at the same age as me, and she had 4 children. I'm a 3rd generation émigré now. I spent most of my life in Italy, where I was born. Last October, I moved to Brussels with my husband, and we were expecting a baby who's now 5 months old, and I came in search of my roots. Between the signing of the protocol and the disaster in Marcinelle, there were 10 years. 10 years of life between 1946 and 1956, and that was the time that my mother spent here in Belgium. In her passport, there's a photo of her still in a nappy, and her slightly older sister as well as my grandmother. Unfortunately, though, neither of them could be here with us because we lost them on the 9th of May. But I did want to also pass on what my mother had told me. My mother had French as her native language. That's what she learned when she came to Belgium, and she always thought of Belgium as her homeland. A homeland that she misses. She has many wonderful memories of her childhood, and you can see the photo here. It was all the women who had to go back to Italy, and then those memories were buried for years. She never talked about the traumatic events that she'd gone through in Belgium, but to me and my sister, both women, she managed to pass on what Belgium had given her. And she passed on the songs she'd learnt at school, the games, and the food. It was from the women in my family that I learnt about strength and courage. I learnt to draw positive lessons also from the negative events in my life. And I tried to change so that I can become a better person. I learnt to respect others, to be kind, and act with solidarity. I acquired these values that came from a faraway place, but it's only recently I worked out where they came from. All I knew was that my grandfather was a miner and that he died in a large-scale accident in Belgium, but I didn't know what kind of person he was. In 2005, I made my first trip to Marcinelle to see where my mother had grown up, and quite recently, the Italian state awarded my family and all of those affected by the tragedy the Gold Medal for Civil Merit. And I started to ask questions and ask my mother about what had happened. It took 3 generations, my grandmother, my mother, and me, to process the pain and start to bring the memories back. 2 years ago, on the 1st of August, and it was in August, unfortunately, my mother's house was burgled, and the burglars took the gold medal as well. It was a real shock. Not obviously because of the financial value of the medal, but because of its sentimental and symbolic value. That day, I, together with my husband and my older sister Martina, we made a commitment that we would recover the lost memories of our family and tell people about them. We've done that in a collection of interviews published by my sister called Our Marcinelle, as told by women, and in a photography exhibition, some of which you can see around us here, which is called The Forest of Memories, the other Marcinelle. The stories and memories which my mother, her sisters and aunts passed on to us are about things and places, about everyday life for those who lived in Belgium in mining families from 1946 onwards. We've looked at those everyday objects and seen the experiences that those people would have had every day at home, at school, at work, on holiday, in the summer, in the winter, in the cold barracks, and in the heat of the dances. We think that we can look at this story from a different angle and get away from, liberate ourselves from the tragedies. We chose a way of looking at life and to the future without disregarding the wounds which were inflicted, because this is a key for tackling a lot of problems we currently face and a useful tool for the community and especially young people. Every individual history, as we know, is part of a collective history, and together we can contribute by telling it to creating the identity of those involved and of a whole nation. Today, as the granddaughter of one of the victims at Marcinelle, I proudly bear the marks of that history. That is why I would like to bear witness to their great humanity, to the historic, social and cultural heritage which we have all inherited from the miners and their families. I'd like to finish with a very short poem that I wrote for my mother at a difficult time in her life. The poem talks about memories which risk getting lost and disappearing with the passing of time, and of the people who can keep those memories and pass them on so they stay alive.
Non del tempo tingerò I capelli, né della donna che gli si...
Time shall not colour my hair, nor the lady who sits beside him. I shall shine their shoes, I shall clothe the nakedness of the one and reveal the bosom of the other. I shall tell the man, time, to look, and the woman, his daughter, to walk.
Fai la brava, se no commuovi anche me. Maria Laura
Franciosi.
Voilà, grazie.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much for having recognized the importance of commemorating memories. Well, Enrica has described very well what's so important for us, that we have to go back to our origins and our roots. I don't have a direct link with the mines or with Belgium. I'm a journalist. I arrived in Belgium in 1993. And I started to get to know the mining towns, and I started to get interested. I was interested to see what one person said to me. He was working in a restaurant. He said, "Don't go over to that other restaurant because it's full of miners." Well, I thought that was interesting, so I went to have a look. So this was in 1993, 1994. At that time, people simply didn't talk about the migration. It was more tried to be brushed under the carpet. People were forgetting about it. They were trying to kind of hide the Italian presence in the mining towns. But as a journalist, of course, that was exactly the sort of thing that made me want to go there, to try and find as many of these miners as possible, to write down their memories, and to try and preserve them. I consulted other books, including the books by Professor Morelli, who's with us today. Very important books on this story. I think it's very important that we look at these individual stories. Well, I spent days every weekend going around and collecting these memories. And I managed to meet about 150 miners over the course of a year of work. When I presented this book at the time, the embassy wasn't interested. Yeah, you've got to ask Mr. Grassi, says Mark Tarabella. No, it wasn't Mr. Grassi at the time. At the time, they weren't very interested. Those who were interested, however, was the Christian trade union movement. They were very interested in my book. And they helped me out in publishing the book. What the process of writing this book brought out to me was just how much these miners wanted to tell their stories. They were saying, I've got 40 years of my life, 50 years of my life to tell to you. These interviews quite often lasted a long time. But they opened up my eyes to a completely different world, a world with a great deal of humanity and a lot of human interest for Europe as well. We're commemorating the 70th anniversary of this agreement, but what I think is important is to stress one thing. All of these miners talked about Europe. They said, we, the immigrants, we are Europeans, and we have been for the last 50 years, since we came here. That's what the miners told me. We are Europeans. They had moved from one country to another, and they tried to get a sense of being European, Italian, and Belgium all at the same time. We are Europe, they would tell me. These were people who had left their home country to find work in the mines, and I think that they were right. That's what Europe is. It's an exchange of people, workers. It's not just a question of treaties. It's not just a question of standards and rules and laws. It's a question of individuals, people. Anyway, as I said, my book was written at the very outset of the move towards a single currency, when the euro was simply an idea. But I just wanted to just recall one episode that a miner told me about. When the miners came here and were waiting for remittances from the miners, they used to have to use a special system for that. Part of their salary was directly sent to the Bank of Italy. There was a fixed exchange rate, and after a few months, in many cases, the Bank of Italy would get these remittances through to the villages where the families lived. And I think that that's something that's worth bearing in mind now that we have the euro. That would have made things considerably easier. But the miners who went back to Italy, they tended to put all their banknotes in big wads in bags, and they were scared that otherwise they would be stolen, so they would hide them under the train wheels, and they would only pick them out again once they'd got back across the Italian border. And they were a bit scared that when they had to change trains in Switzerland, they might lose all their money. So there are lots of quite memorable stories. Now, I mean, there are some stories I have to tell in Sicilian. Someone said, "Madam, they've ruined the country." That in many cases there were debts back home in their villages that had to be paid off. And the only two positive voices that you would hear, the only two positive lines in the Italian budget were the remittances from the immigrants. It was the immigrants who allowed Italy to be prosperous. It was the remittances from the miners, the money that they'd sent back. So that's two things I would like to stress. First of all, the value of feeling European. And secondly, the value of giving something back to the country of origin as well. I think what Mr. Tarabella had to say was very important. There were workers in other sectors as well, not just the mines. The quarries is one, but there's also the steelworks as well. There were also miners who arrived during the fascist era as well. I met quite a few of them. These were people who had escaped from Italy. They tried to run away from the risk of being put in prison. They'd been sent on the run by the fascist regime. And what I think was interesting is how the protocol was actually managed. don't know, 70 years ago tomorrow this was. And the protocol had quite a lot of different provisions in it. In a way, it was a kind of barter. It was coal was to go to Italy, and workers were to go to Belgium. But for me, this was a particularly important agreement because for me, this represents the first step towards European integration. Gradually, Belgium realized that as these miners arrived from Italy, and these were people who were selected, they were inspected, they were sorted out in terms of their size, of their suitability for different types of work, depending on their build. They were basically selected. The first impression was that they were being sold like slaves in South America or something like that. But at the end of the day, these strong pairs of arms that were sent, as one Swiss sociologist has said, that turned out to be men at the end of the day, people. And in this book, I tried to allow these people to express themselves, but women as well. There's a study that Mrs. Buccioni has carried out, and I think that she has done something important. She stressed the role of women in the role of integrating these communities in Belgium. She stressed the importance of the role of women, not just the role of those miners that arrived in Belgium, because all of these people helped make the Belgium as we know it today. Thank you.
Grazie per...
Thank you for your input and also for telling us about some of those human experiences. Now I'd like to hand the floor to Mr. Bruno Mariano, who is a photographer and the son of an Italian miner who came to Belgium. If I could just ask you to stick to the time limit so that everyone will have time to speak. Thank you. Well, I'm going to speak in French because we are Italian, second generation Italians, but we have a French culture. Or I can continue in Italian. Well, 1946 was a historical period, and what I've heard about it is that when Italians came here, there was still food rationing. I lived in the barracks that we heard about. If I could just describe them, they were wooden barracks, 30 to 40 meters squared, with a little garden outside to grow vegetables, and everybody had rabbits because rabbit was the only meat that you could get. It was the only meat that Italians ate. The first luxury item that the migrants bought was a radio where you could also play records. Every one of the barracks had one of those. The Sicilians, the people from Calabria and Friuli, they all wanted to hear music, and it was a very noisy atmosphere on a Sunday. People were really celebrating with all having their music on at the same time. As the son of a miner, as a second generation immigrant, I made a special documentary, and it was a personal venture because I wanted to look at the town in Abruzzo where people had come from to go and work in the coalfields in Belgium, and a village called Eluge in the Borinage. The one in Abruzzo is called Atripinetto. I heard people's stories, I filmed, and I went to the Borinage and to Italy and filmed all of these second generation immigrants and who were telling us about their experiences of the time. That's really the story of my family and those who I'm close to. I have 3 or 4 hours of conversations that I've recorded, but I'm just going to pick out some of the things that people said. For instance, my sister was talking about her childhood in the barracks, going to school, and then returning to Italy, because lots of people went back to Italy when they retired. A lot of people went back to the Abruzzo region. My sister had to adapt to going to school in Belgium and then to adapt again to be able to work in Italy. So she had to make that adaptation twice. Also, Domenico, who's 94, a former miner, tells in the documentary about his first day at the mine. It's very moving, and he says something that's really great. I'll say it in Italian. The mine attracts you, it draws you in. And once you've been attracted by it, you can't do any other job. He also tells a rather funny anecdote. He was in Belgium an evening in November. It was icy cold, and there was an Italian who was a tenor, a singer, and he started to sing Ave Maria by Schubert. Despite the cold, everybody stayed to listen. Everybody wanted to hear this tenor sing that song, and it was a kind of cultural integration between the Belgians and Italians who were there. And then there's my aunt, who was a miner's wife. She was talking about the daily lives of women in the barracks. She was saying that women would go to the mines to meet their men when they came out of the mine. When the miners got there, they were all completely black. They all looked exactly the same. So she kissed a man who she thought was her husband, but it wasn't her husband. But it all turned out happily in the end. I also interviewed Jean-Pierre Josse, a Belgian. His mother was a Belgian widow, and she married Mario Bertucci, who then adopted Jean-Pierre. He talks very affectionately about his father. His father had been a prisoner of war in Libya during the war. Then he'd gone back to Italy, and from Italy he'd gone to work in the coal mines. These are interviews which last about 20 minutes in general, but I've just taken a few sentences from each one. There was Fredek, Paul, a son of a miner who married an Italian. He learnt Italian just by reading photograph novels. At the time, women in Italy used to read those, and that was how he learnt the language. So this Fredek, his father was deported to Germany as a forced labourer. He was liberated, and then he also ended up in the mines. Another anecdote is told by Ryszard Lukowski, a miner's son, and he tells rather a shocking anecdote. He had an Italian family living nearby as neighbours, and they asked for a cat. So Richard gives them a cat. And a couple of weeks later, they ask for a cat. So his father then says, no, don't give them another cat because they eat cats. But they were very difficult times. That's a true story. Then there's Giulia, a widow of a miner. Her husband, Francesco, was involved in an accident down in the shaft, and when he was found among the corpses, he was still alive. He carried on working, but 8 months later, he opened up a cafe where all the miners would go after they'd finished work. There were Poles, Italians, all that kinds of nationalities. And people used to drink quite heavily at the time. I'm going to finish with a sentence which is the subtitle for my documentary, which is called Coal in Their Veins. They left the light to find the darkness of the coal mines. Thank you very much.
E adesso la parola a Lucia Vergaglia.
I'll now give the floor to Lucia Vergaglia, who's a spokesperson for the local authority in the commune of Orvieto. Well, of course I would like to thank you ever so much for inviting me today. Well, I'm here for quite a special reason. It's because you, Mrs. Agea, were the one who took up my idea, and that's why we're all sitting around the table today. This is an event which is an important one for a number of reasons. We're now in a house that is the very symbol of European democracy. It's become something active and functional. In the past, it was just a consultative body, but over the years, it has become much more active and important and has a much more marked impact on people's daily lives. And so it's an honor for me to speak before you today. My personal experience is as follows. I've never lived in Belgium, but I've heard plenty of stories about the miners, and they were certainly a major factor in my childhood. Well, I've had the story told to me, but I've also had it explained to me. I've studied law, and it's very important for there to be a kind of political activity that opens up a conduit for the kind of experiences we've heard today. Well, I'm not in favour of nationalism and things like that. I think that there are many risks for democracy out there at the moment, and there's dangers for our social stability. But I think that one thing that's very important is that Italy has got an important role that it can play as a founder member of the European treaties. It shouldn't be just another country sitting around the table and signing. With the Ventotene Manifesto, we had a very important personalities like Mr. Spinelli. They were all signatories to that. They've been opponents of fascism. They were giving a spark of freedom at a moment when peace had finally been restored to Italy and the rest of Europe. So it's an intellectual and spiritual moment that laid the foundations for Europe. And you could say that the foundations of Europe were dug by human arms. Europe has got a kind of superstructure with 3 pillars. I won't go into all of the technical jargon, but the foundations for all of this structure, what's it built upon? It's the work of human beings, hard work. We've heard the story from this gentleman who shares a surname with me, and that's no accident. But the stories are never ambivalent. He described hard work, but there's also integration and progress. Mrs. Franciosi said this. Europe shouldn't be a kind of oligarchy. We live here. Our children grow up here. We want to ensure that there are proper rules for safety at work. And after the accident in Marcinelle, that was a kind of trigger. It was a scandal at the time, and no one knows that better than me. Enrico Puccioni, who has done some excellent work on this subject, will certainly confirm that the trials that were carried out at the time were an absolute farce. The judge was the brother of the engineer who had been accused of negligence. But if we look back, you had 136 Italians killed there, and as well as workers of many other nationalities. The king came to render homage to the migrant workers. That's something that doesn't happen very often. So that was a step, in a way, to building mutual trust. What they said is, we wanted arms to labour, but what we got was men, people. And it was when the families that came to join the men that integration really took place. The protocol basically makes it sound like an exchange of goods. But it goes a little bit beyond the kind of human capital that we hear people talking about. As if human capital was some kind of company-owned asset or something like that, capital good. But 70 years on, it's become something different. It's a kind of human patrimony, a human heritage. It's a kind of heritage that can be transmitted and passed down through the generations. Well, I'm sure I don't need to remind you of the etymology of patrimony as a word. The pater, the father. It's a concept that we have in our civil code as well. That's to say, due diligence, acting like a good family father. That's the way it's put in the Italian legal code. So, it's a matter of pride for me to celebrate this day of commemoration. Of course, this has nothing to do with the more solemn events of the 8th of August. This is a very different kind of event, a different kind of world. Yes, we have been talking about sacrificial victims. Yes, that's the right way to describe it. But at the same time, you can say this protocol was a kind of generational change. Yes, you can see it as wares, goods, prices were agreed, trains would arrive every Thursday. It was a kind of deportation in 1946. But there is some further reasoning that you can follow here. It's not just a question of immigration. A kind of community was created, and the integration of successive generations has led to progress. Progress, moving ever closer towards full integration. And I could certainly throw up an idea for Mr. Tarabella. It's European integration is absolutely linked to football, and I think that there should be a united European team. But I didn't want to simply just remember the past today. I don't want to just look at events that belong to the past. I think this should be a day of recognition. A recognition of a sacrifice, but also recognition of a founding moment. Because all of the other European institutions followed on from this social experiment. The coal and steel community was from 1951. The integration, the treaties, the agreements are based upon the very successful outcome of the treaty signed between Italy and Belgium in 1946. That's my impression, and it's been confirmed by my studies. I'd certainly like to thank Mr. Borelli for his introductory words. There is a project that we should be moving forward with. It's not just the disasters at Marcinelle that were important in this whole story, but Marcinelle had a huge impact on the way that kind of hard labour was carried out. And there are many positive situations there too. Anyway, I am moving towards my conclusion now. I think that it's important that we should have some kind of day of recognition that we could include within the celebrations for this protocol that was signed 70 years ago tomorrow. But I think that we have received as an inheritance a great human heritage, patrimony. Thank you.
Con la proiezione del...
We're going to be screening a video now, and that will start a very important part of this conference for me, because it will open up the possibilities for taking option. I'd like to immediately hand over to Anne Morelli. I think she is the most qualified person to comment on this. She's an expert in immigration, and she is universally recognized as being the greatest expert on Italian immigration, as well as including the topic that we're talking about today. First, we'll see the video, and then I'll hand right over to you. Thank you.
Bruxelles, Ministero del Lavoro. Ecco il ministro Troclet, rimesso da un grave incidente. Lo raggiunge il nostro ministro del Lavoro, onorevole Fanfani. I due statisti si dispongono a firmare il protocollo che estende ai nostri lavoratori nel Belgio il regime di assicurazione sociale previsto per i belgi. Questa è pace in atto. Cadono i malintesi esclusivismi. Si apre il fiducioso orizzonte della giustizia sociale.
Un po' di luce.
Perhaps we could have some light. If not, people will fall asleep. Right. Well, are you tired? You might be a bit hungry. So perhaps I should give you a more of an innovative view of Italian immigration into Belgium. I could speak for 7 hours like Fidel Castro does, but I only have 10 minutes. So I just wanted to give you some information and tell you about this new research that's been done on Italian immigration to Belgium. This research has just been published, and it's designed to debunk a lot of legends. It's difficult for me because I'm going to get a crick in my neck if I have to keep looking round at the slides behind me, but I hope that you can see the slides. What are the legends then about Italian immigration? I have to confess that for the first time we've given this the right title today, because in these days it's correct that we're celebrating the anniversary of the protocol from 1946, but in the Italian and Belgian press we have seen that 1946 was the start of Italian immigration into Belgium, and that's wrong. The ambassador was completely right when he said that Italian immigration started in the 19th century, that there were Italians here before the First World War, whether they were exiles, whether they were street performers or anarchists who tried to assassinate King Leopold II. He was an Italian anarchist who'd come to Brussels precisely for that purpose. There were Italians here then, and during the 20 years of fascism in Italy, as the ambassador said, there was a large group of people, 30,000 people who came. There were 33 different newsletters published in Belgium during the fascist time, and all in Italian and of all different areas on the political spectrum, communists, anarchists. The agreement in 1946 then, of course, is very important in terms of the quantity of immigrants, but Italians were already here. What's also wrong is if we say that after 56 there was no more immigration, the agreement wasn't in force any longer. There are still thousands of Italians who were on their way at that time to work in quarries, in metalworking, in the coal mines, as Mr. Tarabella said, the quarries. And there were thousands of Italians who came to Brussels to work in the major industrial activities, in the large factories. Michelin had a very large group of Italian, mainly Sicilian workers here in Brussels. That immigration didn't just end in 1956. The ambassador was quite right when he talked about modern immigration. We could say that it's of a slightly different type, but these are still people who want to improve their own lives. There are all of these Italian immigrants here because they want to improve their own lives. They come here, they may be civil servants, they could be civil servants at a lower level in Italy, but maybe they want to climb the ladder professionally here. They might say that they want to build Europe and all of that, but they still have that same basic reason for emigrating. Something that we need to clear up is what is said about men being sent in exchange for coal. And it's a very simple way of putting it, but it's wrong, because actually German coal, American coal, they were more interesting for Italy. There wasn't a single kilo of coal which was given to Italy for free in return for a worker. It would seem, from what we've heard, that for every worker a certain number of kilos were given to Italy, but that's completely wrong. Then there was a shortage of manpower for the mines in Belgium. Italians came at specific times when there was a lot of unemployment in Belgium. Why did they bring these Italians then if they had such high unemployment? Well, because there was some social tourism going on by the company owners. They wanted to have workers who would be paid less and who would accept conditions that Belgian workers wouldn't. The Belgian workers were heavily unionized, very well organized. They didn't want to do the work that they'd done during the war as prisoners of war. The mine owners went to Poland. They tried to get Poles to come. They went to Spain. They couldn't get any Spaniards to come. And finally, they went to Italy because Italy had been vanquished. It was in desperate straits in economic, social, and political terms. Here we can see a map which shows us where the Italians went to in Belgium, the places where they were concentrated. If we say there are 200,000 Italian nationals, they are mainly concentrated in the places that they first went to: Liège, Charleroi, La Louvière, Mons-Bourlinage, the quarries in Tubize, Quebec, and on the right you can see that major Italian community in Brussels, which is divided into two parts. So we might have time to have a look at that later. It's completely split down the middle. In the northwest there were factory workers, and in the southeast there were more well-to-do migrants who came to work in the European institutions. The Italians that came then have stayed where they initially settled. There's Limburg then in Flanders, which is a mining area, and that was the main place where Italians lived in Flanders. These Italians in Belgium, more than half of them were born in Belgium. 54% of these Italian nationals who have an Italian passport were born in Belgium. And that makes us think of their symbolic belonging to an ethnic group. They sometimes said that they were Italians because they didn't want to do their military service. That's something that no longer applies. But lots of them want to stay Italian and keep that link with Italy. I think it might be difficult to tell you a great deal on the basis of these maps. Let's just have a look through them and see whether there's something I can point out. There are Italians in Belgium who come from Sicily and the south. They are the majority, but in Brussels, in the southeast, there are a lot of people who come from the north of Italy. Just as with the first miners, there were some who came from the Veneto and Friuli in northern Italy, because there had been a special system for recruitment. The Belgian mine owners weren't happy with the first migrants who came from all over Italy, but were mainly subversive socialists, trade unionists, who tried to leave. So the mine owners then got a second wave of migrants through the Vatican, and they went to the parishes in the north of Italy, where then the priests would choose people who were perhaps the most shy, who didn't have any political commitments and weren't subversive. One of the other points I'd like to address in terms of the legends is this legend that people were treated well, and there were people who will have good memories of their experiences because there was great poverty in Italy, but there was a lot of racism as well. People used to call me Morelli Macaroni as well. In the 70s, there was a song which had rather unpleasant racist overtones. The Italian workers came here to counteract the initiatives that were taken by the Belgian trade unionists and the Belgian workers. They wanted to keep a low profile. In Liège, they didn't get off the train at the main station. Instead, they would get off at Vivny, which was a good station, so that the Belgian workers wouldn't see them, because they weren't very happy to see the competition. Not everyone got a warm welcome then. They didn't get a warm welcome because they were Catholics. Now people say, oh, you Italians, you had a warm welcome because you're all Catholics, and so we didn't have any problems. First of all, the Italian Catholics didn't have the same kind of church as the Belgians. They would go to a separate church. They would have separate sacraments and separate communion. And they weren't all Catholics. In the book that I've just published, I point out that during the 20 years of fascism, there were Italian Masons, Freemasons, who took refuge here. There were those who were against the church. And then in 1984, when there was a vote, we very clearly saw the result. 44% voted for the communists then, which wasn't one of the church's favorite parties. So that is another one of these false myths which is passed on, looking at things through rose-tinted glasses because they were all Catholics. I do, though, have to draw to a close now, otherwise I am going to go on for 7 hours like Fidel Castro. Today, for Italians, there's this idea that everything is going well, but perhaps we can see that map of unemployment. On the other slides, you can see the results from elections. The Belgian Italians have always voted more to the left than voters in Italy, which is normal if you have a migration where they're workers. Not everything is going so well for Italians in Belgium because there is high unemployment. No, that's not the slide. I need one before that. There's high unemployment. There's a 9% rate of unemployment for Belgians, but it's 21% for Italian Belgians. not because they're lazier than Belgians or anything like that, but because there's been a replication of social patterns, so that the children of workers also are in that socio-economic category. And apart from all of the examples we've heard, Mr. Tarabella, Mr. Di Rupo, Sandra Kim, but if we're not careful, we won't see the wood for the trees. There are those individual examples of people of social mobility, but that working class group is very affected by unemployment, and they have lower qualifications than the Belgians who are at a similar social group. That area to the south of Brussels, where there is a high level of qualifications, but the children of miners often go into vocational education, to technical schools, and that means that they don't often go into jobs with great prospects. So we do need to see this as a balanced picture. It's not white or black, it's quite grey, really. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you very much for that very rapid run through of your work, but I'm sure that it was firmly based on your scientific results. That allows us to get a better overview of the state of affairs. I think it's very important that we had Mrs. Morelli together with us. I'm a member of the Employment and Social Affairs Committee, and what I see is a kind of circular model that keeps coming up. It's the circular nature of history. But in many cases, history can give us lessons, and it's a question of whether we're in a position to receive those lessons and to build upon them. Now, if you look at the situation when the Italians arrived in Belgium, Belgium was a country where they had good social protections. I think about 2 years later, the Italians got their first proper social security provision. But have we learned something? We have been able to make a few steps forward, but there are other areas where we haven't made enough progress. In the Parliament and in the various committees, we really need to stress the importance of health and safety at work. Accidents in the workplace took place in places like Marcinelle in the immediate post-war period, but these kinds of accidents are still taking place. They're dying because the proper safety apparatus is not in place. These days we do talk about workers' health and safety. We're still calling for proper work to get rid of asbestos. The workers of the 1970s and the 1980s spent decades breathing in asbestos particles, and now they are suffering from that. Illnesses in the lungs, cancer. I think we'll be dealing with the consequences of asbestos for the next 15 years at least, but not enough work is being done. Yes, we need compensation for the victims from the past, but we still need to call for the necessary measures to be taken for the existing asbestos to be removed. The economic crisis that Europe has been wrestling with for so many years now has allowed social guarantees and workers' protections in the workplace to be simply dismantled. The first thing that we should be doing is protecting these kind of social protections. When there is an economic crisis, then workers see their companies under threat. They see their social guarantees under threat. That's the result of what we're seeing at the moment. It's important to study the past so that we can say that some problems still exist today. Europe is putting forward the wrong models. Ambassador Wouters rightly said, the problem of education is key. The problem is that we educate people who are aware, people with a conscience, people who have an identity. But education can also be a ghetto, a place where people are excluded. There can be places where marginalization becomes a phenomenon that can lead to radicalism. What we need today is a model that needs to be improved so that we can improve our daily lives with courage, because otherwise there's a danger that Marcinelles could be repeated everywhere, a social Marcinelle, an economic Marcinelle, an environmental Marcinelle, a workplace Marcinelle, catastrophes that we see constantly coming around again. So in my remarks, I'd just like to apologize for taking up so much of my time. We're a bit behind schedule, but I just wanted to say that we need some kind of permanent observatory, a kind of link between the institutions. There are so many Italians who've been in Belgium for decades now, and we need much better cooperation to try and deal with the topics that are raised by the kind of issues we've talked about today. It's been a pleasure for me not only to have Anne with us here today, because of course we're speaking the same language and it's a beautiful thing, but I'd also like to thank all of the institutions, particularly Ambassador Wouters, Ambassador Grassi. I think that we've had a moment where we've brought people together. This is a space where we've all been able to become part of a single project. We had planned to show part of another film, but I'm afraid we'll have to save that for some other time. And there's so many more things we could talk about now. But before I close, I'll give the floor to Ambassador Wouters for a very brief conclusion. And I'd also like to thank the director, Paolo Grossi from the Italian Institute of Culture, who will also be saying a few words about the upcoming events to commemorate and remember the presence of the Italians in Belgium in every way. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'll be very brief, because there are a lot of conclusions that we could draw, and I think the analysis of this phenomenon is constantly evolving, as Professor Morelli said. But there are three things I'd like to say. First of all, that your initiative, with all of the personal stories which have a very strong impact, have been extremely useful. So thank you for those. They, at least as far as I'm concerned, have helped me go over the same ground again, but also discover it in a new way. When we read the text, it does seem like a very different kind of agreement from the ones that we make today. There were very specific socio-economic conditions, and this also had an impact on the building of Europe. Secondly, even though we know that migration is a timeless phenomenon, I think we can highlight the significant difference between the Italian immigration in the post-war period to Belgium, more recent Italian immigration, but also new types of immigration into Belgium. The socio-economic conditions play a very important role. Migrants have very different profiles now, and they come from a whole range of countries of origin. So I would highlight that difference between the initial Italian immigration. Finally, nobody said that the migrants here had it easy. Not everything went well. It wasn't all through rose-tinted glasses. It was all rather grey, as Professor Morelli said. But in the stories that they recounted, there did seem to be an underlying desire to live together. And I think that is a key point if we want to face up to the challenges, like the challenges of Italian migration and also migration in general. Thank you very much.
A lei la parola, tra l'altro.
And I'd just like to take the opportunity of your presence with us here today to ask you if you could show willingness to organise another event of this nature together in future.
Grazie.
Well, thank you very much. I'd just like to thank Davide Borelli and Laura Agea for this very important initiative. We've heard some very interesting contributions today, and the history of Italian immigration is a major building block in the whole European identity. So it's a pleasure for me to be in the European Parliament today. I'd certainly like to take up what Laura Agea said about how timely all of this is. We have invited the Mayor of Caselle Monferrate to talk to us about some of the issues of some of the existing problems. There's a struggle that's ongoing and will continue to go on for many years. Yes, okay, we're now 60 years on from the Marcinelle tragedy, but the subject of accidents in the workplace and occupational hazards remain very much on the political agenda. Since mid-2015, we've been carrying out some reconnaissance work to try and gather information about all of the events coming to commemorate the 17th anniversary of the protocol and the 60th anniversary of the Marcinelle tragedy. It's been a very stimulating, interesting work. That there are suggestions coming in from all over Belgium, and they've been quite important in putting together our program of official events. Now, I won't go into all of the details, but one thing that struck me from putting together these commemorations was the desire to celebrate, the desire to work as a part of a collective effort to recognize identities. What we see is not so much people from the first generation of immigrants, but people from the second and third generations looking at their own past. They're looking at getting an awareness of their own roots. It's leading to cultural, artistic products that we've tried to give space to in our institute. We've seen new works of university research from academia. as you've seen, we've got this new volume of studies that Anne Morelli mentioned. And we will be organizing a conference on the 8th and 9th of December where we talk about Marcinelle in particular. And we'll certainly be building upon a lot of the ideas that have been touched upon today. We've been supporting academic research. But as I said, there's also a lot of artistic products. And we've got photo exhibitions. One of those was mentioned by a previous speaker. And Max Palagatti will be displaying photos. And we've also got two Italian artists, Silvio Carazzo and Enzo Scaramati, who are going to be displaying photos as well, together with interviews, documents. And they're interested in investigating, studying the past, but also artistic creation at the same time. We also have a theatrical event. We've already had productions in the Institute, and in December, celebrating the Festival of Santa Barbara, we will have a presentation of a work called La Supercherie by a famous director, and that will also put on stage 3 generations of migrants. It's focused on a golden wedding anniversary with two couples, but bringing together the families of the 2nd and 3rd generation. And it's not always easy to deal with some of the tensions that exist within the family. So that's the idea of that theatrical production. I'd like to conclude by just raising one subject that was mentioned in the debate. We've been working hard to bring this out in our program, and that women are a major focus of the new research that's being carried out. On the 4th of December, we'll be having this play where we not only is the author a woman, but the people on stage are the female. There's also work going on at the University of Namur at the moment. Professor Anne Constantinidis is putting together a group of students who are going to study the stories of individual women, and they're going to put on a theatrical performance as well about women's experiences, those who lived through these very difficult events. My personal feeling from the contacts that I've had is that this is an effort to express a double sense of belonging. All of the Italo-Belgians I've met, all of the immigrants and others, have expressed very strongly their Italianness, but also their full sense of ownership of their new Belgian identity. Thank you.
Posso?
May I? I'm not down on the program to speak now, but I'd just like 30 seconds of your time. And I'm president, so I'm allowed to do that. I just wanted to add something. I, at the beginning, said that I wanted this to be the beginning of a process, the first step along the way. And now, at the end of this conference, like all of us here in the European Parliament, even though we're a legislative body, we need to get that information from the past and see how it can be updated. Laura glossed over something, but it was an idea that I think we should take up, and that's the idea of having an observatory, a watchdog within the European Parliament, where we could look at migrant workers abroad, and we wouldn't just leave this experience as something in the past. I think that it's a good initiative and I will support it as co-president and work towards setting up this observatory. Hopefully it will produce tangible results and it will be useful not just for Italian MEPs but for everyone throughout Europe. Lara mentioned that really quickly, but it was something that I wanted to highlight as well. Thank you.
E adesso concludiamo.
Well, now just try and conclude. All I can say is thank you to all of you who have come today. I'd like to thank all of our guests. I'm not going to go through all of you by name because we've already heard your stories and we know you. Beautiful stories, painful stories. And I think it's a lot more important than we might have imagined at first sight. I think that it's a very significant conference. I'd like to thank the ambassadors. Well, one ambassador has already left because he had another commitment. But I think that the ambassadors have given us a lot of extra value added. And I'd like to thank Davide for having helped me to get this event up and running. I'd also like to thank all of the interpreters because, as ever, they are not only excellent, but stay with us far beyond the planned time. The interpreters kindly thank the chair. Thank you very much also to our communication team who've been working on this event. You've supported us a lot in getting the message out about the event through the social media, etc. So thank you very much to all of the team for having helped us throughout this week. It's not always been easy this week, and I'd particularly like to thank my own staff, Alessandro, Marco, and Fabio. They are the people who made all of this possible. So I have no problem in saying that they believe more in me than I do in myself, but where I don't manage to get the job done, they do it. So I've relied on them much more than I should have had to in organising this event, and I'd like to thank them very much. And I'd like to thank all of you. I think that this is indeed the beginning of a path that we can walk together.